right, everyone. Welcome back. Good to see you. Another episode of Revisiting the Road to Serfdom. We're going to be doing something a little different that we did from other episodes because this chapter, quite frankly, well, I guess we did this in the last one too. My guess is this is going to become the norm, is that we're going to be doing probably one chapter per episode like we did with the last one. But this one, we're going to be talking about planning and the rule of law. So if you remember last time, chapter 5, we discussed planning and democracy. And one of the kind of through lines through the book generally is where Hayek kind of lays out the incompatibilities between planning and all of these other things that are fundamental to a liberal society. And so last time it was about democracy. This time he's going through planning and the rule of law. But to kind of recap the previous chapter, for those of you who might have missed it, one of the things he talks about is, okay, like in a democratic society, that's based on this notion of consensus. You know, if you're going to go back and watch the previous video, you might want to play a game called Take a Shot every time Truman says either consensus or coercion, because that word comes up a lot. But the last chapter deals with what do you do when you don't have consensus, because you're not going to get it under planning. And so Hayek is saying, look, they think they might be able to get this, but they're not going to. So then they're going to have to deal with that. The reality that most people don't agree with what their plan is. And so they have to circumvent the will of the people generally. And so a couple of ways they do that is through unelected bureaucratic committees. They'll use vague terminology to describe what their plan is. So they'll talk about the common good or the common welfare. One of the things I said that might map onto today would be X is a human right. Another thing they'll do is they'll just use force and like ignore the will of the people. And one of the ways they might do that is by ignoring proper elections. So one of the things that they kind of talk about, you know, thinking out loud a little bit is, okay, if a labor government puts all these policies in place to try and make planning permanent in society, move them towards socialism, what happens if the will of the people is to vote them out of office? And so they were like, well, we might have to come up with some guarantees to make sure that this new government can't undo all of our progress, which is to say the will of the people can't undo all of our progress if they decide they don't want to go along with it. And then another thing they'll do is like, look, they'll probably create policies that remove any limits on their authority. So they can use these democratic methods. We talk about democratic socialism and so on and so forth to remove any restrictions on their ability to govern. You know, and one of the distinctions that we discussed last time was, look, the U.S. Constitution is all about the freedom from the force of the government. And that's totally the exact opposite of what planning is, because they remove any restrictions on their powers. And one of the quotes that's from last chapter that has really stuck with me is that it's not about the way in which a government gains power, but what limits that power, right? So you can vote yourself into despotism. You can vote yourself into a place of total servitude by just electing an authoritarian dictator. So it's not, and that's democratic, you know, there. So democratic socialism, you know, whatever. It's not the means in which the power like comes to power, but it's what are the limits on that power that matters. And that's what kind of tees up this chapter on the rule of law, is because he's saying, here is how they use the rule of law to remove their own power and how they instantiate a lot of these crazy policies into law. So I don't know, Kevin, does that about sum it up in terms of chapter 5? Did I miss anything?
No, man, you hit on a lot of key points there. You know, it's the war call of the conservative now is like the limited government piece. You know, limited government is extremely important. And I do want to tease this out because we normally go through this at the beginning of every chapter. Limited government is a liberal idea. Liberal in the 19th century European sense of liberal, where you want the least amount of government coercion as possible to allow people to act as free actors. Whereas we think of liberal in the American sense, that is completely the opposite. That means I want to introduce as much government coercion so I have less responsibilities for my life and everyone can be taken care of. So that is a very important distinction, although I don't think liberal even comes up anywhere in the text here, but I know we're probably going to talk about it quite a bit throughout this chapter review.
Yep. Yeah. And thank you for reminding me. Yeah, there's at least two words we have to define probably at the beginning of every episode. One of them is liberal, as Hayek uses it in the classical sense. Think conservative, think maybe libertarian a little bit. Whenever you hear that word, and the other one is planning. Which is this book. Whenever you hear planning, think about like a top-down government control of all of the facets of society. So they would use planning as this kind of term to describe whatever it is, that they thought was the right thing. But planning was just, instead of people having the freedom to choose, someone above is going to choose for them. So this, what are they called? Philosopher kings are going to make these decisions for an entire society and plan the way the society runs, from the economic exchanges, those aren't going to be free anymore, to the way the law is applied, whatever. And so whenever you hear planning, think socialism, think total government control, think the opposite of freedom of choice as an individual, to be honest. But that's another one that it's kind of fallen out of fashion in our, contemporary vernacular, but there are definitely like one-for-one comparisons. So again, I would say socialism or democratic socialism. Progressivism, I think, would be another one that would be right in line with the basic idea of planning. Anyway, so thank you for reminding me that. I totally spaced.
That's a good clarification, because planning, I think, I'm trying to think of what word we use now today, just all the time. That is the kind of light, fluffy version of socialism. Like they used to use the word socialism, then everyone's like, oh, that's a bad thing. So we're going to go to planning now. For an actual democracy, it's like, all right, we're going to use planning. It's another softer term. We don't hear that anymore today, and it's probably been replaced by some sort of generic progressivism, right? So there's always a word that, he talks about in a previous chapter where socialism is not going to go away. It'll just come back under a different name. Planning was one of those names. Now the new name today could be, democratic socialism, which is something that they did kind of say back then. I don't know if Hayek realized how much that get caught on today, but there's always kind of this evolution of these terms to kind of mean the same thing, but they know they need to rebrand it because the last revision of that term has been completely blown apart. No one wants to be associated with that, right? That makes sense.
Yep. Yeah. Do you think so? Just to piggyback on what you just said, do you think that the contemporary version of that would be to just use the words "do something" in a sentence? We need to do something or take action. We need to do something about climate change. We need to take action on systemic racism. We need to do something about COVID, or whatever. Like it's time to take action, or it's time to do something, or address is another word. We have to address this thing. I know that those are terms that are pretty ubiquitous, but you really only see them being used in the context of like progressive policy prescriptions that are just wide sweeping expansions of government power. So, you got me thinking there. So I don't know. Do you think that would be because even if you look at the executive orders and stuff that I was talking about earlier that we'll, pull up here later, a lot of those have to do with like, in order to address X, is here's what we're going to do.
Well, just think about
maybe even would be another thing that might be used for planning because it requires force. It requires action.
Well, I think equity is a part of planning. But to go on to your take action bit, think about what planning is. Planning is like, okay, we need a centralized power to plan this, because what's the opposite of planning? What's the absence of planning? To them, it's like chaos. To us, that's a free market. That's free exchange is the lack of planning, lack of coercion. So I think that take action is actually really, really good comparison to today, because what is the opposite of taking action? Well, it's not taking action. It's the government sitting there not doing anything. And to a lot of the self-prescribed liberals of today, or really the progressives of today, that's a nightmare. Whereas to most of us, the true liberals, the conservatives, the independents, the libertarians, that's heaven, right? I don't want you to take action. That's lack of planning, lack of action. And to them, it's like, oh, it's going to be chaos. If we can't tell you what to do, how are you guys going to know what to do? It's treating the people as children rather than, your represent, or the people that you are representing.
Yeah. I don't know if I have anything to add to that other than I agree.
I know we're already like sidetracked compared to where we were going to start on
right.
this one, but I do think it's a good thing to tease out a little bit there.
It
But
is. And, and honestly, part of that is I was at the tail end of what you were talking about there. I pulled up the Green New Deal because I wanted to see what their wording was. And
yeah,
it's the same thing. It's the sense that it's the duty of the federal government to create a Green New Deal, to achieve this, to invest. So, I mean, those are terms that they're not really using,
mhm,
at least in that. But I think that the general point you made is correct, and that there's got to be ways in which I think it's important for people to key into, like, yeah, this is an aside here that we're on right now, but it's important for people. Like, I mean, CRT is one of those things. People need to hear horror when they hear that. Socialism is, people need to hear no, like terrible, like servitude, right? And so for all of these things, like if there is this term like planning here, that, I guarantee you Hayek, whenever he heard someone say we need planning, he was like, oh God, like, that put a pit in his stomach. And so we do need to identify those contemporary versions of these ideas, because I mean, like you said, some of them have gone away, some of them have been whitewashed, and some of them have been replaced with other, social justice or whatever thing. So
mhm.
I think that does matter. Anyway, sorry for the distraction, but
Yeah. No.
continue on
I mean, so
with the next quote about.
right. So I mean, the name of the last chapter, chapter 5, was Planning and Democracy. The name of this chapter is Planning and the Rule of Law. So planning is involved with both. So I think it's a good thing to tease that out at the beginning. But the first quote or context I'm going to take from the book actually comes toward the end of the chapter, but it does really fit nice and neatly between these two when you're bridging the planning and democracy and planning and the rule of law. Because, the previous chapter talks about the incompatibility between planning and democracy, and how a democracy needs that limited or restricted power, but even a democracy needs to temporarily put those powers aside in times of war. Right. So think of this time of war as a temporary state of planning, I guess. So even though this is a necessity, advocates of planning will use this temporary condition to justify a permanent economic planning solution. So that's what we don't want to get into, and that's what he puts toward the back of the chapter. But I think it's good to tease it out now. I think we've also talked about this in the introduction. He teased out a little bit, because remember, this is written in 44.
Yep.
And then after 44, he got to see, okay, we're out of this war, and why are we not taking these wartime, plans out of the economy? People are just like, well, it worked during war.
Yep.
I guess it works now. So this kind of teases it out a little bit. So he actually starts out with a quote from The Economist. So, quote, democratic government, no less than dictatorship, must always have plenary powers in posse, which just means in potential, but not in actuality, without sacrificing their democratic and representative character. And then he continues by saying, plenary powers may be inevitable in wartime, which, of course, even free and open criticism is necessarily restricted. Back then, it was more criticism that was restricted, but now think of it as, it would add any coercive power of government, for example, like using their manufacturing resources currently in use and switching them over to wartime resources in some form of economic planning. It's kind of how you can see it, but today. So, tell the quote, but the always in the statement quoted does not suggest that the economist regards it as a regrettable wartime necessity. Yet, as a permanent institution, this view is certainly incompatible with the preservation of the rule of law, and it leads straight to a totalitarian state. It is, however, the view which all those who want government to direct economic life must hold. So I think the two big things that I take away from this quote is something I took away kind of at the beginning when he teased it out, in the introduction, is one, that we shouldn't use a temporary wartime condition for a permanent economic solution. Like, why would you use something that's meant to be temporary, meant to fit in this little window in this particular situation, and say, okay, well, since it fits in this particular situation, let's just expand it and use this as our permanent economic solution. Like, that's crazy. Why would you use it? It doesn't make sense in that way. And two, this is a permanent state of government coercion, which will inevitably lead to totalitarianism. It's allowing these plenary powers where the government can kind of just dip in whenever it feels it's necessary. And we even see this, which covered in a previous chapter, of this language of war, right? The war on drugs, the war on poverty, the war on terrorism. All of this language is used to say, all right, well, we're going to take this power temporarily, and if we think we're in a time of war, even though no one's shooting a gun right now, when we're in times of war, we're going to take this overbearing coercive power, and we're going to use it to try to crush whatever the proverbial enemy is at that time. And that is directly how do you go to a totalitarian state. And it's something we really need to key in on when we kind of hear that language.
Yep. And to piggyback on that, the enemy, real or imagined, right? And part of using that wartime vernacular to address non-war situations, one of the things that is in that introduction is they're like, hey, look, savvy politicians will use this as a way to create a situation where there's no logical endpoint to them not having the power anymore. The Milton Friedman quote, there's nothing quite as permanent as a temporary government program. And so like what he's saying there is like, look, they're going to come up with these ways to deceive you into thinking that this is necessary right now. Like they've seen how war, I mean, you referenced in the introduction, these people who are already in the mindset of planning are looking and going, oh, the entire economy is being commandeered by the government. They're taking over manufacturing. They're doing this stuff. And there was these arguments that were cited in like Scientific Magazine and stuff, if I remember right, that he quoted in the introduction where he's seeing them already at the tail end of the war. When Hayek realized that they were going to win, the Allies were going to win, he was like, oh crap, look at what the planners are already talking about. They're talking about how do we keep this permanent? How do we maintain this? And the quote that you just set up there, or that you just did, I think tease like the entire theme of this chapter out perfectly, which is, okay, so how do we like make these things permanent? How do we get people to be on board with this? And if they're not on board with it, how can we just change the society and change the laws in such a way that there's nothing they can do about it otherwise? And I also like, last thing here, what he says is that, like, once again, there's so many really good through lines in this book. And one of them is, if you hold this view, this is the other view that you hold. This is the consequences. And whenever he says there, however, it is, the view of which all those who want the government to direct the economic life must hold, which is, that it being the government has plenary power to do anything. Doesn't matter whether it's in wartime or not, they can do this. And so he's saying it's just that logic progression that you mentioned, I think, in the very beginning, our first episode, was, look, if you're advocating for this, this is the consequences. It doesn't matter what your intentions are. And, you need to know this, because my guess is you don't actually want this thing. Socialists, if they saw the consequences of their ideas, would probably say, no, just kidding. Right. And so this is one of those times where he tees up one of the ways that that those dystopian nightmares become a reality, which is through the perversion of the rule of law and eventually the eradication of the rule of law. Actually, so Kevin, how about this? One thought I just had is we should probably summarize what the rule of law means. And I know that he talks about it in this chapter. But whenever we say the rule of law, what should people be thinking when they hear that? Like, what is the rule of law as Hayek is laying it out here?
Yeah. I mean, this gets teased out a little bit in the middle of the chapter as to how it's defined quite differently by each side, where the rule of law in the context that we're talking about, which is actually going to be covered in this next quote here, is a law that's set up that everyone understands so we can predict each other's behavior. And it's not arbitrary. It's not meant for, there's not this law for white people. It's not this law for black people, although, at a time, that's certainly how it was set up. It is a law that we all follow no matter what. So we understand the rules of the game effectively. You cannot, it's very, very difficult to play a game, or you should never play a game if you don't know the rules ahead of time. And you certainly should never play a game if the rules are going to change in the middle of it. Right. So that is what we talk about the rule of law. It is not this military rule of law that some people are on the left are going to say. They're going to hear rule of law and they're going to be like, oh man, this sounds like, the 20th century Nazi kind of stuff. They're really strict in the rule of law. And as we're going to see when we progress through this chapter, that is not the case. That is not the way it's defined, especially in the how Hayek defines it. But, I think how you and I understand it's just got to be a rule set in front of us that we understand prior to doing anything else that we can both follow.
Yep. Yeah, that's exactly right. So I totally agree. Do you want to get into that quote that you just kind of alluded to?
Yeah.
That where he goes over this on page 112. All right.
Sure.
Do you want me to read that? Or do you want, okay.
Yeah, you can go.
Nothing distinguishes more clearly conditions in a free country from those in a country under arbitrary government than the observance of the former of the great principles known as the rule of law. Stripped of all technicalities, this means that government in all its actions is bound by rules fixed and announced beforehand. Rules which make it possible to foresee with fair certainty how authority will use its coercive powers in given circumstances and plan one's individual affairs on the basis of this knowledge. Though this ideal can never be perfectly achieved, since legislators, as well as those to whom the administration of the law is entrusted, are fallible men, the essential point that the discretion left to the executive organs wielding coercive power should be reduced as much as possible is clear enough. While every law restricts individual freedom to some extent by altering the means which people may use in the pursuit of their aims, under the rule of law, the government is prevented from stultifying individual efforts by ad hoc action. Within the known rules of the game, the individual is free to pursue his personal ends and desires, certain that the powers of government will not be used to deliberately frustrate his efforts. So I think one way that this kind of, if the previous chapter's theme was consensus or coercion, this chapter's theme is something like the rules of the game are fixed beforehand versus them being arbitrary. So either they are something we all know ahead of time, or they just are arbitrarily created and imposed and executed on individuals on the basis of the circumstance rather than on the basis of something that was agreed upon ahead of time. Does that seem like a fair way to tease that theme out a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, it's a simple idea, but when you apply it in the real world, it seems to be harder to grasp, right? Because we want some mobility and flexibility in law, right? We want to be able to understand different circumstances, but when that gets pushed too far, then all of a sudden the rule of law becomes exactly that, arbitrary. And when it becomes arbitrary, I mean, that's not really society you want to inherit. You want to know what you're going into at any given moment, in any given situation, to understand, all right, here's the rules of the game. Here's what I can do. Here's what I can't do. I don't want to have to, go into a place, ask for something, and get under threat of arrest. And I think you have some good examples of, how they do it in Britain and the crazy stuff that they're implementing there by these I don't know if you call them laws, but they're certainly, things that'll go on your permanent record, if you will. So it's understanding the rules of the game before you start playing the game, which is so important. And you should never enter a game where the rules can just change right in the middle. And that's kind of the scary part. You can't have an organized society without these rules. And he kind of mentions a little bit here, the anarchist idea of there's no government. Is that possible? No, not really, because there are some freedoms you have to protect, right? The freedom to life. If someone can just kill you and get away with it, then now that freedom of life is gone. So there needs to be some restrictions. There's just no way to do that without some coercive power. But we need to understand and limit that power to those kind of basic ideas and implement that rule of law, and not, branch it out and keep expanding it like so many countries do, and something we're seeing here in America today.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. And I like what you said about the rules of the game. And so much of that is, I mean, exactly what you said. It's vital to a functioning, civilized society, is that I have to know, generally speaking, how you're going to interact or how you're going to act, in X circumstance, how the government is going to act in X circumstance. And it becomes impossible to do anything. You can't, I mean, if you want to look at a situation where you, like, what happens if you don't know how anyone's going to act at any given time, again, I would go back and look at like how under monarchies or under warlords, like there is no economic growth, there is no upward mobility, because you can't plan anything as an individual. You don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. You don't know if the king's going to come and take your daughter or take your property. And so it's like, why would you even plant it? I think this is not my original idea. I can't remember the first place I heard of it. It's like, why would you even plant a tree, let alone an orchard of trees, if you don't know if you're going to have that property tomorrow? Right. And so it's like, if you don't know what's going to happen, you cannot build these things that are basically the foundations of society, which is that free economic exchange has to come from having goods and services. And those goods and services are things that are planned out ahead of time, or based on some action that I took beforehand. I sat down, I opened a shop, I'm a blacksmith or whatever it is, if we're going back a couple centuries. But in order to do any of that, I have to know that no one's going to come and take my stuff. There's not going to be some random tax collector that's going to come and tax me into oblivion. And so the minute you step away from those things where people kind of generally understand, even so, going to Thomas Sowell, he even talks about how in societies where they had even racist laws, where they had like in, I think one of the examples was some country in Asia where either Jews or Malaysians or something are treated differently, or in countries in Europe where Jews were treated differently. One of the arguments he made is like, if they understood like that, what the discrimination is going to be, obviously not arguing for discrimination, but if you, at least you understand that like the discrimination is a fixed thing, then you can at least plan something to try and work around the discrimination. So even that is better than something that's completely arbitrary, where you can't make any plan whatsoever as an individual.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I like how you get into that, Thomas Sowell, that even if there are discriminatory laws, that you understand, again, the rules of the game ahead of time. When someone, unfortunately in the Jim Crow South, when a person of color walks past a diner that says whites only, they understand that that's probably not the best place to go in there. Or on the other hand, if they organize some sort of protest and go in there, they also understand what's going to happen. They have a general understanding. So it kind of works both ways. Of course, we're both here not advocating for that type of discriminatory law. In fact, we're very explicitly advocating not for it. We'll get into that later in this chapter, actually. But knowing the rules of the game, even if you know you're going to violate those rules, is actually important as well.
Yep. Yeah. That's exactly right. So that seems like a good place to go into that next quote there.
Sure, I'll take that. Next quote, the planning authority cannot confine itself to providing opportunities for unknown people to make whatever use of them they like. It cannot tie itself down in advance to general and formal rules which prevent arbitrariness. It must provide the actual needs of people as they arise and then choose deliberately between them. It must consistently decide questions which cannot be answered by formal principles only, and in making these decisions, it must set up distinctions of merit between the needs of different people. And this goes back to the last chapter when he talks about the social scale of values and the hierarchy of ends. Someone in a general planning society, because you used the word planning before, as an individual, obviously I'm going to plan my life. I'm not just going to walk around and bump into stuff and be like, figure it out as I go. You want to plan your life as an individual. Yep. But when the state has that power, they need to build this social scale of values to decide what is best, what to prioritize, just like you do in your life. What do I prioritize? But now they got to do it for, hundreds, thousands, millions of people. And that changes the game. Now you gotta build this hierarchy of ends and say, all right, what do we want the ends to be for these certain groups? And that builds in that arbitrariness. Continue the quote then. When the government has to decide how many pigs are to be raised or how many buses are to be run, which coal mines are to operate, or what prices shoes should be sold, these decisions cannot be deduced from formal principles or settled for long periods in advance. They depend inevitably on the circumstances of the moment, and in making such decisions, it will always be necessary to balance one against all other interests of various persons and groups. In the end, somebody's views will have to decide whose interests are more important, and these views must become part of the law of the land, a distinction of rank which the coercive apparatus of government imposes upon the people, end quote. So basically here there's no clear decision on when people say planning is inevitable, which he kind of starts out this quote is they always say planning is inevitable. That is not as logical as saying, authoritarian is inevitable under planning. That is the logical step there. We talk about logic here. Planning is not needed. We've seen what society can do, how we can advance without this restrictive, coercive planning. But when you start adding that planning in there and that planning grows, that what do you call a coercive apparatus of government that imposes these plans on people, this social rank of values on people, it grows, and it's inevitable to go to authoritarianism after planning is implemented.
Yep. And there's so many things in that quote that I think tease out the broader, I guess, problem here. So whenever he says, so there's just a few words here that I latched onto mentally. The planning authority cannot confine itself to providing opportunities for unknown people to make whatever use of them as they like. So those who are planning, they see just like giving people equal opportunity or equal access to things should they deem it, desirous. That's being confined. They can't do that. They can't tie themselves down in advance to formal rules which prevent them from being arbitrary. So understand that the planner sees laws that are laid out ahead of time that people understand that they are also bound to, is something that is confining them, that ties them down. But instead, they have to just make decisions as they come up. It has to be arbitrary. And I like that word he says, it must provide for the actual needs of people as they arise. And then again, that is a generous quote. Like they have to provide for the needs. It's like, no, another way of saying that is they have to address the situation as it arises, and then choose deliberately between them. So again, this is a situation where it's saying, like, since there is no universal scale of values that we all have agreed upon ahead of time, that the planner has to come in and deliberately choose and arbitrate between us, or maybe not even between us when we ask for it, but to say, no, this need is more important than this need, and we're just going to instantiate that in law, and then maybe we'll change something, change something over here. But I mean, again, he's talking about like pigs being grown and hats being made and all this other stuff, or shoes or whatever. You can't have things set out ahead of time to determine that. You have to just be able to change it willy-nilly, however you want. And once again, to tie it back to the last chapter, that's going to necessitate coercive power. It's going to, because what happens when the person says, no, I want to make more hats than that, or I want to sell it at this price, or I want to go here and I want to buy this property. Like if that individual desire or the individual plan comes into conflict with the plan of the planners, the government on the macro level, so to speak, then they have to have the coercive power to say, sorry, Charlie, you're going to be subject to this just like everyone else. And so I think that the point is it does a good job of saying, like, no, they have to be able to deliberately make these choices. And they see themselves as, another way of wording that beginning sentence there is he's saying equality of opportunity is something that is prohibitive and restrictive, which again, we're going to get into that, but is something that planners see as a bad thing, because it takes them out of the game. Right? Equality of opportunity takes them out of the game. It's like, no, everyone has equal opportunity, and then people use it how they might. There's a few quotes later that talks about how this will create inequalities, but that's the best possible scenario because the alternative is despotism. Anyway, but yeah, I think that the way that he discusses there, like again, just laying out those distinctions, I think is pretty huge. Which I don't know if you have anything to add to that. But the next part about the blindness seems like a good place to go. So I think this is your bullet point here. True blindness and ignorance to how laws will impact people is vital. The alternative is actually, I think I typed this. The alternative is to know, which is to say know and understand the disparate outcomes. And so he's going to lay out the fact that you have to, like, whenever people create laws, they cannot necessarily know like how that's going to impact people differently. If they do know that, then it's not an equal law. It's not an equal thing. So you have to make a law. And he in that quote that you just read, he lays it out there. It's like, yeah, people might have some understanding, but you have to mitigate that as much as possible, where it's like, we don't know what's going to happen here. It's a coin flip. The law has to be like that, because the opposite is them knowing how it's going to impact people. And if you know those things, then that will change like what you're trying to do there. And so it has to be equally applied to everyone. But this quote, there can be no doubt that planning necessarily involves deliberate discrimination between particular needs of different people. Hey, Kevin, what's that Ibram X. Kendi quote again?
I don't know. I haven't read it. Yeah, no. So that the past discrimination is to make up for present discrimination, or no, the present discrimination is to make up for past discrimination, and future discriminations to make up for present discrimination. And it's something I have listed in the subpoint behind this, but it perfectly goes into the idea, right? This idea of planning didn't die; it evolved. Okay. So you talked about take action. That's certainly one of them, but now it has spread into a bunch of different ideologies, including, what is it called? Anti-racism, right? CRT. This type of stuff is derived from the same material, right? And there's a really good quote from a couple chapters back about the origins of Marxism and how people don't even understand the stuff that's coming out of their mouth or where it's came from. That's the problem with speaking with bullet points or general ideas that you kind of like, so you just want to forward them. When you don't understand where they come from, you'll find out when you do your research, oh man, this came from something that probably wasn't as good, and I kind of want to push myself away from it, but then it's too late. So I think this is exactly what I think of when I see a deliberate discrimination is Kendi, and that awful book that you should never read, but read my review of.
Yep. I agree, and I agree. So he's saying, look, planning. So again, this is socialism. This is the progressivism of today kind of thing. Uh, necessarily involves deliberate discrimination between particular needs of different people, and allowing one man to do what another man must be prevented from doing. So this is not equal treatment. It must lay down a legal rule must lay down by a legal rule how well off particular people shall be and what different people are allowed to have and do. It means a return to the rule of status, a reversal of the movement of progressive societies, which, in the famous phrase of Sir Henry Maine, has hitherto been a movement from status to contract. Indeed, the rule of law, more than the rule of contract, should probably be regarded as the true opposite of the rule of status. It is the rule of law in the sense of the rule of formal law, the absence of legal privileges of particular people designated by authority, which safeguards that equality before the law, which is the opposite of arbitrary government. So again, there's that dichotomy. If you have a neutral principle of the law where it's equally applied to people, that's the opposite of arbitrariness. That's the opposite of planning. And I think he lays out here another good point where it's like this going back to a rule of status, like it was if I'm a lord or a noble in some
feudalism.
house. Yeah, that's exactly right. So I have these special privileges, and there was no upward mobility in these things. Like the closest you would get is if the king, his son, for whatever reason, wound up taking your daughter as a concubine or something, you know what I mean? Or if you're in the gladiatorial games and you can raise up, that way, Maximus, but it's like, those are not preferable. So this rule of status is like, you're always going to be in whatever hierarchy you're in. And it's like, I'm better than you based on these immutable principles. Sounds familiar. Or I have special privileges based on these immutable principles. Sound familiar? And so he's saying this is regressive. This is taking us back to the rule of status. It's a reversal of the rule of contract. So he goes, and there's even a progression there where it's like rule of status, bad. Rule of contract is like, we both agree to these things, but we might still have different statuses. And rule of law is the laws of the land are laid down in such a way that they apply to the government and people equally. So it's just, if you can navigate that, you can rise or fall based on your own decisions, but it's not going to be on the basis of some outside force that causes that.
Yeah. Whenever I think of the rule of status, I think that feudalism of the lords, and I always think of the Office scene where Michael Scott, Phyllis is about to get married. I think it's Phyllis. And Michael Scott yells, prima nocta. And he doesn't understand what it means, but for some reason, this makes me think of that when it comes to the feudalism. But I mean, that's a great point. And, I have written down here, and I think we covered this, again, might have been the introduction, but the kind of brilliance of understanding that we're not progressing, we're regressing. This is a reversal, like, right? You literally use it here, reversal. Toward the rule of status, which is, progressives imagine themselves as progressing past or transcending the current liberal society. They claim to want to be liberal, but like we said at the beginning, they don't understand what that word means, but they want to go to a post-capitalist, a post-Christian, a post-modern society, and they don't understand. They're regressing to a pre-capitalist, pre-modern, pre-Christian society, which is not something we want to live in. Okay. I mean, feudalism quite literally was the lords saying, well, these peasants, it's not, through fault of their own. They're just peasants. They don't understand. They treated them like children. It's like, they don't understand, how to live for themselves. Does that sound familiar? Does that not sound like our political betters, our intellectuals of today? I mean, that is what planning is. That's a central part of planning. It is not progression. It is regression. They want to go back to where power was centralized. And power could just
infantilizing the population.
Yeah. And it's just, again, switched in some people's brains. And normally it's going to be the young people who are very idealistic, who think, no, this is postmodern. It is. It's like, well, read a history book and you'll quickly realize it's not. This is how it used to be. And you want to go back there. And that's not a society that any of us should want to live in.
Yeah. And I think it's telling, by the way, that, the idea that there is just so many things that are kind of in the modern zeitgeist and the progressive lexicon that are so crazy, that even if we went back to the 90s and someone said, yeah, they're advocating for discrimination, in the name of equality, they're advocating for racial preferences, or advocating for segregation in a lot of these places in the name of equality. People would say, are you insane? Like, what are you talking about? And the fact that, I mean, one, again, it just speaks to the prescience of Hayek here. He's talking about like, this is going to require discrimination to do this. And what do we have? It's part of the lexicon now, and part of a lot of these policies where it's like, we're going to have, here's one of those where they use different words. We're going to have spaces. There's this space for people of color, this space for these people. We have to have spaces that are for these people. It's like, that's segregation, dipshit. Like, that is what that is. Like, you're just, don't try to church it up. Your daddy must have really hated you naming you Joe Dirt. And so it's like, this is the same thing. Like, you're just calling it something different. And so it's like, it just blows my mind, I guess, is as an aside, that we have all these ideas that I was pretty sure that we'd all agreed were evil, like, discrimination and segregation and treating people differently based on immutable characteristics. And now they're becoming, it's like, no, actually, you're a bigot if you don't do it. You're a transphobe if you don't want to have sex with a person with a penis, if you're a heterosexual male or female, whatever you're, all these things where it's like, this is crazy shit, but this is what this ideology does.
Yeah. Now we're banned on YouTube. Thanks. Yeah. I mean, well, first I thought this was a classy podcast, and then you quoted Joe Dirt.
Dierte.
That went out the window. But I mean, you made a good point. I mean, are we getting closer or further away from Jim Crow if we were to implement the policies that Ibram Kendi wants?
Yeah, closer, for sure.
This is the
apartheid.
Perfect example. Yeah. This is a perfect example when they ironically use apartheid, applying it to other people. But I mean, this is a perfect example of how to revert backwards. I explained a few episodes ago where it's, they think they're doing a 180 on racism, but they're just doing a 360 on racism. They're twirling around and looking at the same racist object and be like, hey, anti-racist. So it's I don't. Some people, it's like, I don't know. Are you doing this on purpose? Was this like a joke? Am I unpunked? Like, where's Ashton Kutcher going to come out? And it just never happens, unfortunately. Well, at least never happened yet. What's going to happen at the end of 2021? Pandemic's over. Ashton Kutcher comes. No, I don't think it's going to happen, but we can all hope. So
I don't generally hope to see Ashton Kutcher in my day-to-day life. But
I know. I just think of Kevin Malone when I think of Ashton Kutcher, but yeah. So do you mind if we get to the next part? What?
No, I'm thinking of the Kevin Malone thing you're talking about.
When he puts on the toupee and say, it's not Ashton Kutcher.
What is that in?
Kevin Malone.
Oh, Kevin. Oh,
yeah.
Kevin. I was thinking of like real people. And so I'm like, okay. Because in my mind, I was thinking like Demi Moore and like the Butterfly Effect and that 70s show. And I'm like, okay.
No. Is it Brian Bob Garner? There we go. I think that's the actor's name.
Keep going.
I'm just like all in the office quotes. All right. So
no, I love it. It's great.
So yeah, the next one gets really, I mean, this might be my favorite quote that we have bolded here, because it perfectly encompasses, I mean, basic economics. This is very Thomas Sowell here, which is why I love it. But again, one of the people who influenced Thomas Sowell, one of the people who influenced George Orwell, Hayek. I mean, this guy, again, the logic center of the brains of a lot of these brilliant people. So, quote, a necessary and only apparently paradoxical result of this is that formal equality before the law is in conflict and in fact incomparable with any activity of government deliberately aiming at material or substantive equality of different people, and that any policy aiming directly at a substantive ideal of distributive justice must lead to the destruction of the rule of law. To produce the same result for different people, it is necessary to treat them differently. To give different people the same objective opportunities is not to give them the same subjective chance. I'm just going to reread those two lines real fast.
Yes, please. Yeah. I was going to suggest that.
To produce that same result for different people, it is necessary to treat them differently. To give different people the same objective opportunities is not to give them the same subjective chance. It cannot be denied that the rule of law produces economic inequality. All that can be claimed for it is that this inequality is not designed to affect particular people in a particular way. It is very significant and characteristic that socialists and Nazis have always protested against merely formal justice, that they have always objected to the rule always objected to the law, which had no views on how well off particular people ought to be, and that they have always demanded a socialization of law, attacked the independence of judges, and at the same time given their support to all such movements as the Verrichtenstuhl, which just stands as German for free law, which undermine the rule of law. End quote. So right here, we already talked about that basic idea that's common in Thomas Sowell and all these other great economists, that equality of opportunity produces an inequality of outcome. It's just how it works. People are too diverse. They're too different. They have too many different values. We talked about scale of values. The government trying to bring this into a large scale of values makes the assumption that we all have the same. Guess what? We don't all have the same values. So why would we all have the same outcomes given similar opportunities? Right. There's a book, The Quest for Cosmic Justice by Thomas Sowell, where he talks about people don't have the same equality of opportunities because of cosmic injustices. And that's somehow where the government needs to step in to equalize those injustices. Well, in a world that you do not want this coercive centralized power, you have to kind of deal a bit more with those cosmic injustices. But we still, as a privileged society, and in a real true way of saying privilege, which again, we'll get to later, those barriers are not as tall as they would be in many other countries. So basically, right, the equality of opportunity produces inequality of outcome, but equality of outcome demands inequality of opportunity under the law. That is arbitrary rules. It's arbitrary power. So, this is the central thesis here. And then also the next part with the Nazis, which if you want to take that, the Nazis, as people think, the rule of law, that's very, that feels like a Nazi would say that. No, they hate the rule of law.
Yep.
Very, very much against it. Very much against it.
Yeah. And the part here where he talks about how it's important to understand this is a paradox, or it sounds paradoxical to say if you treat people equally, you'll have unequal outcomes. But another way of thinking about that is if you allow people to operate as individuals due to their own differing and respective, like you said, hierarchies of values, they will have unequal outcomes, right? If you allow people to pursue whatever they want, then whatever they want is going to have different outcomes, right? It's going to be entirely different. And so you're going to have to force, you're going to have to apply force and treat people differently if you want to achieve equal outcomes. And the crazy thing is again, this is with any of these things, if you look at the policies where they're moving AP math and other AP classes in schools, whenever you are forcing equal outcomes, all it does is lower standards to the bottom. Everyone ends up equally poor, equally miserable, equally enslaved. You're not going to make everyone equally wealthy, equally productive, right? And so all it is a lowering of standards through force. And that's the Harrison Bergeron thing, where it's no, you're not going to bring people up. You can only force other people down in order to achieve equality. And you can even do this, I'm trying to remember what the context was. It might've been even just the collegiate ministry I was part of, where we would do an exercise where it's one person standing on a chair, another person's on the ground, they lock arms, and the person on the ground tries to pull down and the person on the chair tries to pull up. And it's which one is going to succeed or more likely to succeed? It's the person on the ground is going to pull the other person down way before the person on top pulls them up. And that's how it, the way even No Child Left Behind is a example of that, where it's anytime you try to equalize outcomes, is my point, is that you always have to, everything gets lowered. It doesn't bring everyone up. That's what happens whenever you take someone, I think Peterson quotes this, is if you have someone who's not a very good worker or whatever, and a maybe some kind of site manager tries to put them on a team with a bunch of people who are really good workers, is it ends up bringing the productivity of that team down. They don't raise the one up. And so it's you have to have a thing where people have equal opportunity, because you're always going to have people that do not want to act on that opportunity. I go back to the people I picked up in my car who were passing Code Red Mountain Dew with Everclear in it or whatever, that just want to be homeless. It's how are you going to lift that person up to be equal as someone making $200,000 a year on the basis of labor? You're not. You're only going to be able to bring people down. And that's what this is that it's unequal treatment of people that ends up driving everything down. Do you think that this would be a good time to get into some of these contemporary examples of the different and disparate outcomes?
Yeah.
So I'm going to save some of that Great Britain stuff for whenever we get to that part here a little bit later. But so for the folks at home, again, to quote Norm Macdonald, like one of the purposes of what we're doing here is it's not just to talk about a book that's really interesting or really prescient or that scares the shit out of you if you understand it. It's to try and marry this onto our contemporary context and say, okay, he lays out implications, he lays out logical progression here of these ideas and where they lead to, aka serfdom. And so it's like, why is that relevant? Well, it's relevant because we're seeing a lot of these things play out today. And so in the context here where he's talking about like, you're going to have to treat people differently if you want to force these equal outcomes, because you're naive to give the quote from, was it Adam Smith or John Stuart Mill? I think it was Adam Smith, wasn't it, at the beginning of the last chapter, where it's like only a fool would think that they could even do this.
Yeah, Adam Smith.
And so like if you're foolish enough to think that you can try to force these kind of changes, this is where this leads. But here's some examples of this happening today in our country, in the United States. If you're not in the US, that's fine. But these are happening in other places, even worse, to be honest. So here's an example. So Advancing Racial Equity in California State Government, a strategic analysis of recommendations to institutionalize racial equity in California State Government. So this is a .org website. This is something they're doing in California right now. So racial equity, Kevin, tell the folks at home, racial equity. How is equity different from equality, and how might that be exactly what Hayek just mentioned here?
Yeah, this is a very Orwellian trick where they flipped it out and like everyone just agreed, okay, looks good. I mean, it's close enough. Equality and equity, they kind of sound the same, right? But equality, depending on the context in which you're using it, means normally equality of opportunity. Like we're treated equally. You and I are treated equally. Me and someone who's of a different color, different race, treated equally. But equity means we have equitable outcomes, right? That means this is something that is planned, if you will, that the ends are planned. So when they flop out racial equality, great thing. Martin Luther King wanted racial equality. Did he want racial equity? I don't think he would totally agree with that, especially if you explained it and expand it the way that it's actually, thought through here, where it's like, okay, we want, if we have a local government, it must directly represent the percentage breakdown of the racial makeup of whatever, whatever place that person is governing, or that body is governing. And as Thomas Sowell explains in a couple of his books, that's not the way any place in the world has it set up unless it's forced. But again, forced, now you're inviting all this coercion in the door. Right? You talked about institutionalized, a key word there. That means you are putting this in the system to live forever. It is in there. You cannot reverse it, right? You might be able to democratically institutionalize it, but once it's in there, it ain't leaving. So it's very important. Those words. Yeah.
What's ironic there is they're saying institutionalize racial equity in California state government in the name of reducing institutionalized racism. It's like, we're going to put in institutionalized racism in order to combat institutionalized racism. So that's the logic there.
And what way should you,
no, you're fine.
If you have an institution that is ingrained with racism, why would you then trust that institution and give them more power to get rid of it? I mean, what's the problem here? Is it just the people running the institution? Is it just because it's not you running it? It's not you running the show that it's not working? Or is it the institution inherently corrupt itself? And when you give it more power, it just builds more corruption. So why are you trying to solve this problem with the problem itself?
Why should we trust the people who are talking about how racist they are to solve racism? It's like, you just told me you're racist. Like you've effectively opted out of the conversation, asshole. Like that's not like, hey, I'm a racist. Give me more power so I can solve racism. Right. It might be worth it sometime to show that, crazy thing that Kamala Harris tweeted out the night before the election about a difference between equality and equity. It has those flowers and raising people up to the top of a mountain and all that other dystopian bullshit. So people understand that you don't talk about institutionalized, whatever role she's playing in anything, she's the vice president of the United States, and this is about as instantiated as it's going to get in our government. So here's another thing so if you go to ca.gov, Governing for Racial Equity, California's Capital Collaborative on Race and Equity. So these are things that people can all look up. If you just type in California race equity, Like you can see the policies they're putting in and all of the crazy amounts of tax dollars that they're going to be putting forth for these things. And at the U.S. Federal government level, again, we have this benevolent leader in the White House. Joe Biden is very wise. He's definitely the one in charge of the government right now. Don't let anyone tell you anything different. All there mentally for sure. So we have these executive orders. So whitehouse.gov, briefing rooms. These are presidential actions. This is an executive order advancing racial equity and support for underserved communities through the federal government. So promoting equitable delivery of government benefits and equitable opportunities. Well, hold on a second. What's the opposite of equal opportunity? Equitable opportunity, which is force. And I love the wording here. Government programs are designed to serve all eligible individuals. And government contracting and procurement of opportunities should be available on an equal basis to all eligible providers of goods and services. So again, it's like, this is going to be
equal
a totally
to all
equal
eligible
thing. Yeah, exactly.
That's amazing.
So what determines your eligibility? Well, whatever batshit crazy, criteria we laid forth ahead of time.
It's arbitrary. Yeah.
Yeah. That's like to use your Jim Crow example, it's like, look, every place that was segregated, that was whites only, provided equal opportunity and access to all eligible customers, right? Like that's how they could say that, right?
Could you put like a note? I'm just like picturing now in a disgusting picture of like all eligible whites only allowed in this diner. It's like, oh, if you said that, I mean, they were already Democrats, but I mean, are you woke Democrats now? Like it's, I don't understand the logic.
Well, yeah, but it is that. But that's the same wording, right? So they would say, look, anyone can go in here as long as they're eligible, whites only, and so this is the same kind of ideology. But to continue on, so then we have this thing for the OMB, that's the Office of Management and Budget, or isn't that right? Office of Management and Budget, OMB. Yep. So they're going to address inequities in, I think, home estimates, home prices. So some lenders are using computer-generated valuations. This is from an article at marketplace.org, by the way. So some lenders are using computer-generated valuations instead of human appraisers to try and mitigate bias. But Michael Neal at the Urban Institute said computers also erred more in Black neighborhoods. Whether it's conscious or unconscious, discrimination that might be just in the appraisal process more generally is somehow getting built into these models. The Biden administration says it will use fair housing laws, regulatory action, and the development of standards to address inequity in home appraisals. So they're, to break that down for you guys, they're saying, look, we have these algorithms that assess the value of a home. Call me crazy. I don't know anything about these algorithms. I don't know anything about real estate. I don't know anything about any of those things. But my guess is that part of the assessment of the value of a home is maybe, I don't know, crime rates in the neighborhood. It might be the value of the homes around it. It might be how close are they to a law enforcement? What's the response time of law enforcement? I know, at least where I'm from, college town I grew up in, if you lived adjacent to a police officer's house, your home insurance was cheaper just because you were close to law enforcement. So anyway, so I don't know anything about those things, but they're saying, look, the Biden administration wants to assess and take action on, maybe even using regulations, laws, force, coercion is another way to take a shot, guys, to think about that. But they're going to do that to assess, this nasty racial bias that's put forth in home appraisals and minority areas. My guess is that if you were a white person trying to sell your home in a predominantly minority area, your home is still going to be valued the same. Again, just throwing it out there. If someone wants to prove me wrong, go for it.
Like wondering,
so here's another thing from White House.
Well, go ahead. Real quick on this. I'm just trying to think this through. I mean, are they trying to increase the value of these houses? Is that really what they're trying to do? My guess
is they have to get rid of certain criteria, I think it's increase. But they're going to get rid of anything that would drive the value down and thus supposedly increase what's worth.
Gentrifying, right?
But who's going to buy that shit, by the way?
Yeah, but yeah, right. But gentrifying, isn't that like a big deal? It's like you increase the cost of an area that pushes out the more poor population. Is that right? That's but
yes,
I mean,
that is what gentrification is.
Yes, but they're doing that in effect arbitrarily through government. They're just boosting their prices. Like, who do you think's going to buy the houses? Typically, people who are at the same economic status, Now, what do they got to do? Supplement their ability to pay for a home? Like the answer to the new problem that they're going to create by this is more government, right? More government assistance, more government
answer.
Yeah. So it's completely backwards, especially if they rail against something like gentrification. They're literally doing gentrification via government law. I mean, it's crazy to me.
Whoa. Are you
they don't,
saying that they might be advocating for things that they claim to be opposing? Like anti-racism might actually be racist. Hold on now.
Yeah,
Hold
slow down. Come on. We're not getting ahead of ourselves here. Get out of here.
So here's another thing from the White House, briefing room statements. Here's another thing. President Biden is charging Secretary. So this is whitehouse.gov. President Biden is charging Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, Marcia Fudge. Sorry, it's a funny name. With leading a first of its kind interagency initiative to address inequity in home appraisals. The effort will seek to utilize quickly the many levers at the, like you said, federal government get involved at the federal government's disposal, including potential enforcement under the fair housing laws. By the way, what do you mean potential enforcement? If they were already violating the law, then it would already be enforced. This is kind of foreshadowing some stuff we'll get into later about the way laws are executed. Regulatory action and development of standards and guidance in close partnership with industry and state and local governments to root out. So think about that, root out racism, right? This is where you go searching for this boogeyman to just find shit. This root out is a term. I think Lindsay's talked about this at length, where it's like when they say root out, it means we know it's got to be there. We got to find it. This is going ghost hunting here. Root out discrimination in the appraisal and home buying process. These are the kinds of policies and practices that keep Black families, capital B, in Greenwood and across the nation from building generational wealth through home ownership. I believe this is from the speech that Joe Biden, again, our benevolent and very cognitively capable leader, gave at Tulsa on June 10th.
I'm just picturing
whatever it is.
I'm just picturing President Biden trying to say Marcia Fudge in a live press conference with that, like the Marcia Fudge. What is this? What? Huh? What?
Yeah,
you ain't Black. Wait, no, I don't know.
You ain't fudge if you don't vote for me. So here's another thing. Corn Pop. He's a bad dude. So this is, again, we're going through this stuff and we're joking about the fact that our president. But the point is that this is at our federal government and and also at state levels. We talked about California, get into one from Vermont, other states, where they are implementing institutional discrimination to force equity. So this is not equality, this is equity. And those are fundamentally incompatible ideas. And so here's another one getting into COVID. So the VA, minority veterans to receive priority for coronavirus vaccines. That's in the VA, right? Here's from Vermont. The governor of Vermont tweeted this out in April. If you or anyone in your household identifies as Black, which Rachel told us a whole much, Indigenous, or a person of color, BIPOC, including anyone with Abenaki or other First Nations heritage, all household members who are 16 years or older can sign up to get the vaccine. Get yours at, and he shares a link. The reason why that's important is because I think at that time in Vermont, in order to get the vaccine, you had to be either like 55 or 60 or older. But it was, if you're Black or identify as Black there, Rachel, you can get the vaccine if you're 16. If you're 16, so let's ignore the racial part of it. That's against the science of, what were the actual fatality rates of people who were in that age bracket, regardless of what their skin color was. But either way, it's saying like, look, if you're a white person who has every single comorbidity in the book and you're 45, you can't get the vaccine, but a Black person or whatever non-white thing that is, he didn't put Asian in there, by the way, which is interesting, and a whole nother can of worms. But if you're Black or Indigenous or brown or whatever, and you're 16 and totally healthy, and you have a statistical 0% chance of dying of this thing, you can get the vaccine. This is equity in practice, and also how you breed resentment, by the way, in my personal opinion. And then just the last two here. again, equity versus equality. So here's the thing from Washington Post about how Oakland will give some families of color, which, by the way, talking about changing terms, I bet if you went around talking about they're giving colored people money, now you're a racist. So speaking of getting deplatformed from YouTube, but if you say giving families of color, then now that's the very compassionate and correct term to use. It's again just rebranding their racist bullshit. Oakland will give some families of color $500 a month, one of the biggest tests yet for guaranteed income. And so what Oakland is going to do, so there's this area called East Bay that they're going to, so launching this spring and summer, the city's program will distribute $500 monthly to a group of randomly selected families for at least a year and a half. So it's $9,000 total in the minimum. To qualify, families must have at least one child and make less than 50% of the area median, about $59,000 annually for a family of 3. So to pause there, you have to be making about $30,000 a year in order to qualify for this, which will bump you up, and you'll get another, I guess it'd be $6,000 in a year. And I didn't see anywhere in this article or anywhere else that qualifying for this makes you ineligible for any other set of government programs. And this gets into stuff where I've seen controversial people like Stefan Molyneux or whatever talking about, like, there is this cliff where if you're receiving these government benefits, let's say I'm making $21,000 a year annually, but I'm getting $25,000 a year in government benefits, right? So these are numbers that are wrong, but wrong in the right direction. I'm effectively getting $46,000 a year annually. And if I was to get a raise, if my employer was to give me a raise, even by $10,000 a year, which you would think would be great, but it would make me ineligible for all of those other benefits, I would have to turn it down. I would have to stay in this lower income bracket in order to continue to get that additional, effective $25,000 a year in benefits. And so it's like a person has to over double their income, or at least accept something that would over double their income in order to get out of this, what is effectively just total dependence on the government for all these things. But either way, so they're going to give this to 600 people. So there are huge gaps between people of color and our white residents. Oakland Mayor Libby Schaaf. I love how they put the D in parentheses. Like, we had no idea that was a Democrat. I'm glad you let me know. I was worried it might be like a libertarian or a Republican. Told the Washington Post, with the limited resources of this pilot, we would like to understand better how we can understand that. This is a dumbass sentence. Understand these disparities as well as address overall poverty. So the limited resources of this program, by the way, we did the math. It's $5.4 million of taxpayer money that's going to be used to understand disparities by giving people, extra money just for being not white. And again, I think that it again doesn't apply to Asian people, I don't believe. So either way, this is that equity in practice here that we're talking about, and this is already happening. So that was a big long aside from this book that was published in 1944. But the point is for you to understand, okay, look, despite this being written, almost 80 years ago, what he's talking about, forced discrimination, treating people differently on purpose, deliberately, and how that is incompatible with equality and the rule of law and a functional society, like, those are the things he's saying, that this is where planning leads and what is required of it. We're in it right now. This is planning. All of that crazy shit I just read that it's easy to make jokes about, that is what's going on right now. And it has the same end point. It has the same destination, which is societal unrest, requirements of more force, more coercion, more force by the government in order to enact these crazy policies. And then we all end up in serfdom and servitude. So anyone wondering the contemporary relevance of this, there you go. And I'll try to remember to put all those links in the video description. I suck ass at it. I always say it whenever I say quote these things, but I forget to do it. But if people were wondering, just type in government dot or dot what is it? Government dot what's the government dot whatever GA.gov.
Yeah.
What is it? Is it .gov? GA.Georgia. Anyway, just type in like .gov equity program. Like, you can Google that and you'll find all of these things. Like, of the things that I looked up, what I decided, which was a very long aside, was a small fraction of what I found. So this is everywhere right now, guys. And so this is really, really serious shit. It's here. And it again leads to serfdom. Sorry. Okay. I'm done there.
No, no. I mean, you're 100% true. And also, these payment, like the $500 payments, I wonder if they come with like a big sweepstakes check, like for the first one or so. I'm just
Guy in
picturing
a
that.
top
I was like,
hat
yeah,
drops it
right.
off at your
It's like
house.
Uncle Sam or something like that. And,
Yeah.
but I mean, you talk about the democracy part of it. I mean, you're paying people to get hooked on this stuff. If they don't vote in the right people, they get pulled off the stuff. And you're effectively buying votes with their own money and have them
100%.
contribute to the democratic process to put in your planning more permanently, to institutionalize that planning. So this is like this disgusting web of corruption that builds itself into the system and allows for these people to never leave office effectively. And like even when we said, at the beginning, well, the last chapter we talked about, that if you throw democracy in front of something, it doesn't make it democratic. It just makes it democratic for that snapshot in time until they get in. And it's like, all right, well, maybe the next time we get voted out, we got to put in some conditions here to make sure that our progress isn't stunted or reversed. And then we talk about like these backdoor deals, like I believe they're referred to. Well, we got to make an agreement with the Conservative Party that they're not going to reverse these things. And that is how you get into this left-right argument about dumb stuff in the public while they're both in the back room agreeing with each other, making these deals while everyone else argues and thinks they're disagreeing with each other. I think is how you go down that route, is this web of corruption that is they're going toward the planning. I mean, obviously the Democratic Party in America wholesale into the planning, but I don't even think the Republicans necessarily are against it as well. I mean, if you talk about their spending policies and stuff like this, there's plenty of good conservatives in there fighting against it, but not enough. I don't think there's enough people fighting, and that's just in America. I mean, you talk about the UK and a lot of these other places that are too far gone. It's disheartening seeing how far off the road to liberalism, the road to liberty, the road to freedom that we're going down. Again, the road to servitude, and it's just disheartening when you see that.
Yeah, fiscal conservatism from a policy standpoint is an oxymoron, and I don't care if that pisses off, conservatives, but they need to understand that I think that there is definitely a symmetry, not an asymmetry, but a symmetry in the amount of Democrats who think they're advocating for X, but are actually advocating for something entirely different. Like they don't understand what the leaders of their side are actually about. I think there's a symmetry between that on the left and the right. The conservative base does not understand what the people at their who are leading them supposedly are about. Again, don't care if that pisses people off. It's just accurate.
Yeah, no, I'm as the, again, registered card carrying conservative here. I totally agree with you, and it's extraordinarily unfortunate. But anyways, all sunshine and rainbows from here on out, guys. So we'll dive back into the book. So this is where he gets into, I think it's I don't know, Willy Wonka and the Something Factory. But this is where he gets into what we kind of hinted at before about predicting other people's reactions or behavior correctly if you have a correct rule of law that isn't arbitrary. This is extremely important, and I do like how he teases this out. So, quote, "It may even be said that for the rule of law to be effective, it is more important that there should be a rule applied always without exceptions that what this rule is. Often the content of the rule is indeed of minor importance, provided the same rule is universally enforced." Big important
equally,
equally enforced. To revert to a former example, it does not matter whether we all drive on the left or the right-hand side of the road, so as long as we all drive on the same side of the road, right? The important thing is that the rule enables us to predict other people's behavior correctly, and this requires that it should apply to all cases, even in a particular instance where we feel it to be unjust. So, as he talked about here, when a rule is applied arbitrarily, it causes dysfunction within the society. Also, although as we've stated before, that dysfunction is often intentional, unfortunately. But when you, I mean, this dysfunction is like, we all drive in America the right side of the road, unless it's like after midnight, then you can kind of do either side. But really, that's a good example. Like, okay, what if someone said you can drive on the other side of the road momentarily? Like, what kind of dysfunction? Outside of an officer with the lights on, what kind of dysfunction would that create? That would create havoc in a society. So we need to make sure that we understand these rules before you understand the rules of the road before you get on the road. You know, we got to take a test to make sure that we understand these rules. And when you violate those rules, you know, that's when you get a ticket. That's when you understand, you know, what's going to happen next. So, you know, it's extremely important. And I don't know if you want to take the particular instances with these rules, even when they feel unjust, they must be implemented if we want to make sure that these remain not arbitrary.
Yeah, I mean, well, a few things there. I mean, there's an example. I'm trying to remember what book this was. This might have been a Malcolm Gladwell book, but when he talks about, I can't remember the book, but one of them they refer to whenever there was some country that actually changed the side of the road that you were supposed to drive on, from either the left to the right or the right to the left. And whenever that happened, you would have thought that traffic accidents went up. But what happened is they went down because people were being like ultra super careful and driving slower than normal because they didn't know what was going to happen. Right. And so the point is that if you are not sure what other people are going to do, you're going to be more careful, and it's going to slow down society. It's going to slow down everything that's taking place. And Hayek's point here is that the important thing is that the rule enables us to predict other people's behavior correctly. And this requires that it should apply to all cases, even if in a particular instance we feel it to be unjust. I think this is actually an important distinction, or not important distinction, important point to make here, which is there will be times that under the rule of law, something happens that you think is unjust. Have we had anything like that happen in the last week? Bill Cosby, right? Mm-hmm. So there are going to be exceptions where you go, okay, that's messed up. That's messed up, right? In that case, a guy that we all agree, I think unless you're crazy, a rapist is walking free. But if you had to err on the side, is this a John Stuart Mill? I'm trying to remember who said, like, would you rather have 10 or have one guilty person walk free for every 9 innocent people, or every 9 guilty that go to jail? Or would you rather have innocent people go to jail for every guilty person that walks free? And the idea is you would much rather have a guilty person go free than innocent people go to jail. Because you have to have this presumption of innocence. You have to have this system. And by the way, if you're guilty, you're probably going to do more shit that's going to put you back behind bars. That's what recidivism is. You know, if we look at being guilty and come back. Anyway, the point is that you have to err on that side. You have to err on the side of freedom. You have to err on the side of the benefit of the doubt. I think Jordan Peterson makes an excellent observation when he says, how the hell did society even land on presumption of innocence? Like, that is a crazy thing for us to agree on, which it was actually, I think it was in the Code of Hammurabi, which goes back, that's like ancient Mesopotamians maybe, where it was if someone was shown to be making a false accusation, it's like, no, you're actually going to die instead of the person you're accusing. So this is a concept that isn't as recent as we think it is. But the point is that it's rare. And you have to have that in a society that in order to function. And again, it includes time. So just like equal opportunity will create inequality of income or inequality of outcomes, which inequality of income, it falls in that category. Rule of law is going to create instances where we're like, this is unjust. Bill Cosby, this is unjust, right? But you have to understand that those exceptions are going to exist, and they're worth the alternative, which is, again, this despotism and authoritarianism. And so it says a rule applied arbitrarily will cause dysfunction within a society. It's like when people randomly decide to drive, given the authority to drive on the opposite side of the road. I mean, that's exactly what Hayek says here. So do you want to go to the part where it's about punishment, the different things on punishment being applied differently?
Yeah.
Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah. I mean, this is
there anything you'd add to that, to what I just said?
No, although I do appreciate that the rule applied arbitrarily will cause dysfunction is actually my quote. But I'd hope.
Oh, that's yours. Okay. I was like, I don't remember writing that.
I stuck it in there. Sorry. Very Hayekian.
We're very organized over here.
We are. Day drinking. Anyways. Yeah, no. So I like the part, and I don't know if you want me to read this footnote already. And I think this is where we might be getting into the examples of Britain and stuff like that. But I think you know, it's important here in a subnote, and I don't remember who it's from exactly, but It's laid out concisely here that, quote, no punishment without a law expressly prescribing it. So you don't get punished for a law, or you don't get punished unless you violate a law that's been expressly, proposed beforehand. This is knowing the rules of the game, right? If there's some rule that's applied halfway through the game and you already made an action that would violate that rule, you can't be punished for that. So, you can go off base there. And it continues, no crime must remain without punishment, whether the law explicitly provides for it or not.
This is a dichotomy. So he's saying under the rule of law, there is no punishment without a law expressly prescribing it. Under the rule of law, someone's not going to get punished unless there is something that we've all agreed upon, that we all understand is there ahead of time, being the important part, not some just ad hoc thing, arbitrary thing, especially prescribing it. But he's saying that what this system is, what planning is no crime must remain without punishment, whether the law explicitly provides for it or not. So that's a very different thing, as he's saying, like, look, this might not be in the law, but if someone commits a crime as we determine it on the fly, then it has to be punished no matter what. And so that made me think of these things in Great Britain, these hate or non-crime hate incidents. So if you look this up, this is honestly, like, I use the word terrifying a lot, and I really try not to like overuse it, but this is actually, this is really, really terrifying. These non-crime hate incidences. So to date, there's been over 120,000 of these things filed. So you're like, okay, 120,000. I think in Andrew Doyle's interview with Jordan Peterson, he said it was like one every 7 minutes or something had been filed since they first created this. But what a non-crime hate incident is defined by their thing here on citizensadvice.org.uk. Here's another one of those links that I'll probably forget to put in there, but I will really try to remember to. What are hate incidents? The police and Crown Prosecution Service have agreed on a common definition of hate incidents. They say something is a hate incident if the victim or anyone else think it was motivated by hostility or prejudice based on one of the following things: disability, race, religion, transgender identity, sexual orientation. This means that if you believe something is a hate incident, it should be recorded as such by the person you're reporting it to. All police forces record hate incidences based on these 5 personal characteristics. So in the United Kingdom, they have this database of non-crime hate incidences. Okay. Non-crime, very important here. All right. That if someone says, so it's if you or someone else around you thinks that a thing happened. So Kevin and I were driving on the road and Kevin says, hey, what do you look out, asshole? And someone behind Kevin hears that and says, oh, I think he said that because that guy's Jewish. I'm not Jewish, but I think so. It says it right there in the definition. If you think so, if you think, right? So this is literally the definition of arbitrary bullshit that someone pulls out of their ass and just claims it to the police. Except for in this case, it's become institutionalized that they will record it and it will go in a database. What does that mean? So what that means is that this is, if someone does a background check on you for employment, for example, non-crime hate incidences are recorded in that and show up in a background check. So a potential employer will go, oh, well, this person was accused of bigotry, whatever, because someone thought so. And they might not get that job, or people will lose their job. And you have the police, they go on later in the article. It's like police they take this very seriously. They will show up at your house based on a tweet, based on a Facebook post, based on some random thing that someone else said. Again, in that situation, Kevin could say something to someone, or I could say something to someone, and that person does not perceive it as being injurious to them. Some random bystander can say, oh, I think that was motivated by bigotry. Report to the police. Now it's on your file permanently, right? So going back to the quote that Hayek puts here and how this is incompatible with, the rule of law. So in the one case, this is something that we all agree on, that no one's going to get punished unless this is a violation of a law that was expressly laid out ahead of time. And the opposite is no crime, as it's defined through whatever, vague parameters, must remain without punishment, whether or not the law explicitly provides for it. That should terrify you that there is a list where there are consequences for you for something called a non-crime hate incidents. Non-crime, not a crime, not against the law, but it has consequences the same as if you had violated the law. Think about it like this. And so last thing I'll say on this is that, if a person was a sex offender, right, their name goes in a database, which is good. I would rather they be killed. But anyway, their name goes in a database and there's consequences for that. That's a crime. That's evil that has consequences. They show up on a list and then people will treat them, whatever way according to the fact their name showed up on the list, with employment or housing, or you can't live so close to a playground or an elementary school or whatever. The same kind of thing is happening in the UK, or at least a similar thing for not crimes. Not crimes. You pissed a person off. I mean, that's insane. That is insane. So when I say terrifying, I'm not kidding. I'm not exaggerating, being hyperbolic. But this is where all of this leads. The spirit of planning and where it goes and how it's incompatible with the rule of law, equal application of laws that are laid out ahead of time, where, like you said, these are the rules of the game that we all adhere to and understand and help us to predict each other's behavior. How can you possibly predict another person's behavior and what's going to happen to you based on this? This is like policing your own thought and policing your own words to the nth degree here. It's like, well, I'm not going to say anything because I could end up on a fucking list because some person, who it might be for nothing related to what I said. They just might not like me. Right. So this is a definition of arbitrary. It reminds me of, I post about this in my locals. Jordan Peterson's interview with Yeonmi Park, the North Korean, refugee, defector. Victim, pick your term. Good guy. This is one of the most powerful interviews I've ever seen, where she talks about like the oppressive nature of being there. And also she equates it to the university here, ironically enough, but where she's like, you're afraid to say anything because you don't want to be punished for it. Again, even if it's in North Korea, it's against the law. Here in America, she talked about, she was at Columbia University, about how there were social consequences for saying something that might go against the prevailing views, and how it was crazy to her to be doing the same thing in America that she was doing in North Korea. But that's where this goes. This isn't hyperbole. That's a North Korean defector, saying the exact same thing, where it's like, I'm policing my speech because I don't know how people are going to handle it. This is where planning and socialism, this collectivist ideology, leads.
Yeah. When you're going through those British examples, I'm just thinking like how much of a killing Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff would get if they made a book, The Coddling of the European Mind. Because what you described right there is The Coddling of the American Mind, a book they wrote. This is this legalized microaggressions, because that's what that is. That's the perfect term for it, I think, is because a microaggression, although it can be real, some might take offense to what you say, does not mean it was meant to be offensive. It disregards intention, right? So even the examples you use for me, calling some random person an a-hole, if it's a person of the wrong color, well, there's a lot of a motive that could be attributed to me, and you can't have that. That one, that does not correspond with the rule of law, and two, going back to the previous chapter, you can't have that in a democracy. You can't.
Yep.
That eliminates a large part of this free exchange of ideas, this free enterprise system that we have here, that we know it creates all this prosperity. You're living in like a prison state. I mean, it's like you have to constantly be in a state of paranoia. I think of like the Soviet Union, where it's like you don't know what to say. Like there's a movie that I love that I know you didn't love as much, but The Death of Stalin, it reminds me of that, because they're like, even with the Stalin dies, spoilers, Stalin dies, and they're still afraid. They're still afraid to talk around him, like his dead body, as if they're going to get shot in the back of the head if they say anything wrong about him. That's the paranoid state that they are going to create there, and I'm sure they've already created it. In the UK and parts of Europe, and it sounds like that's being created at none other than Columbia University. But I mean, that is the state of the university campus as laid out in The Coddling of the American Mind. That's the state of a lot of like high schools now, a lot of schools. And that's going to start branching out as those kids who are getting used to that sort of state of paranoia grow up and to be adults. They're going to effectively terraform the culture to act just like the university. And that's not, that is how any form of democracy is going to die. any form of liberalism is going to die, because unfortunately these kids don't get taught what actual, like we talked about, European style liberalism is. They get taught the Americanized form of it. And that is how you go down the road to serfdom, is you're going to create this state that's going to mimic effectively these dead states in Europe who have completely gone off the road. And I don't know, if there is an avenue back. And that's the problem, is you get far enough down the road, there's really nowhere to turn around.
Not an easy one.
No,
not an easy one. Yeah.
And not one that's going to come without, unfortunately, revolution. I know the other side likes revolution, but it's something we want to avoid, because no one wants to go the violence route.
Well, yeah, and we already have examples of this in both the university and in our popular culture. I mean, that was the Hidden Tribes study, and we have this just specifically. Well, the Hidden Tribes was our population, and we have Pew Research polls on university campuses where, in both cases, whether it's at the workplace, so if you're talking about general population, workplace, church, social group, whatever, who is most likely, who feels over 50% feels like they can speak their mind. Well, it's the same on campus. Who feels like they can speak their mind in class and on campus? Those who identify as progressive, as activists, as on the far left, right? Even on campus, I believe the study said even center left people, less than 50%, felt like they could speak their mind in class or with their peers. And so what we're talking about now, I mean, that's a precursor. Everything that happens, you're talking about politics downstream from culture. That's another way of saying law, and what's instantiated in law and institutionalizes downstream from culture. How did Jim Crow happen, right? You have the people who were racist get power back, after the Republicans leave post-Reconstruction. And so then they start to inscribe their beliefs into law. Their culture reflected it. So if we have a culture that is fear-based and opposed to freedom of speech, and it treats things like microaggressions seriously, that will eventually be inscribed in the law. That's what happened in the UK. That's what these non-crime hate incidences are. Those are the types of things that will become institutionalized on a official level here in the US, or things way worse. The US, I think, often doesn't just take some incremental thing in another country and gradually apply it here. They'll end up applying something that is like 10 times worse in true American fashion whenever they do apply it. But either way, it leads, like you said, this is despotism, this is servitude. And, that's not hyperbole. I really hope people don't hear us speaking hyperbole here whenever we say that. This is totally serious, very dead serious, no exaggeration.
It's serious, but the only way you can treat some of these serious subjects is with comedy, because it would be too depressing without it. Because I mean, if I got to go to jail for saying that Caitlyn Jenner is a nice dude, like that would suck.
That guy's awesome.
Great. I mean, he was a great Olympian.
Be elected.
There's where's that gray area? If you said he was a great Olympian, well, he was a he at that time. And then, I mean, you talk about arbitrary, we're talking silly right now, but it's not silly to them. We go on Columbia University campus right now and say this. I mean, we're going to be escorted off, other than we don't attend the school. We're going to be escorted off by security real quick because of our hate speech. So it's terrifying is the correct word you're using there. Because, it's happening in the place that kind of help invent this liberalism, this liberal tradition, and it's fallen there effectively almost completely, especially when you have rules like that being implemented. And it's something that we want to avoid here at all costs, and something we got to fight for. And part of it's reading material like this to understand how it's happened in the past. There's people in the UK who looked at Germany and it's like, wow, those darn Germans again. Like, what's wrong with those Germans? There's nothing wrong with Germans, man.
Yeah, look at the ideas.
Look at the trend. Look at the trajectory, and I think we're seeing. I'm not saying the next Hitler is going to be rising in the UK, but I mean the culture is going to effectively kill itself before it goes around trying to take over other places. So scary future. Before
we move on to that next part about speaking of words that have some contemporary context, in the UK, Boris Johnson is the conservative guy. He's the one that we were all really excited that beat Jeremy Corbyn. And that dude, if you look at the policies and stuff, he is there are quotes that he has. You could lay him out next to who's that asshole in Canada? Blackface guy. loves
Yeah,
blackface.
yeah.
Justin Trudeau. There are quotes you can take from Boris Johnson and lay him next to Justin Trudeau quotes, and you wouldn't know the difference.
No.
In terms of stuff on race, on their policies on COVID. So yeah, no, like this is happening there, even with their most conservative government in the UK. And so it's like, no. Whenever we say America is the last holdout, that's not again, it's not an exaggeration. It's not like, well, we're the last holdout, but there's like at least a handful of others. It's like, no.
Yeah, but what happened in the
holdout.
UK? What happened in the UK? Just like we talked about in a previous chapter, they ceased to be an exporter of ideas and they became an importer of ideas.
Yep.
And that is where, I mean, that's a huge trend that if you see, and that started happening, you know, in the 40s, you know, even earlier than that, when they started to look at some of these socialist policies and, you know, seeing how they work before they saw how horrifying it was in the UK and then later in the Soviet Union. But they're importing. It's what I would call a dead culture. They're no longer exporting these ideas. And once the US becomes that, which we're not there yet, but there are certain like red flags you see that I normally see in the culture. I like something as simple as Netflix, seeing all these
Korean movies.
yeah, like, and they're good. Like they're good. They're not great.
Like two of them are good, but
what America's sitting over here doing the woke movies that no one wants to watch, and Korea's at least making something that people want to watch. And now we're already seeing this importing ideas, although I would say very Americanized Korean ideas. But once those ideas, and I'm not like against Korean movies or anything like that, but it's just like one of those red flags. You start seeing, hey, we're importing this stuff. Why are we importing this stuff? Our best export in America is culture. And once that ceases to exist, once the main import becomes Chinese culture, that becomes a problem.
Yep. Here's, can I give one example of that? And let's move on to the privilege thing. Look at what happened with those protests in Taiwan, man. Beijing, Donald Trump, wasn't it Taiwan?
Not Beijing.
No, it's Taiwan. Yeah. Donald Trump, don't trust China. CCP is asshole, you know, and they're waving American flags. You know, I mean, that was
Hong Kong.
You want to talk about, Hong Kong, not Taiwan. Yes. Yeah.
Well, Taiwan's got their own problems.
No, but Hong Kong, you're right. I mean, that's that whole Twitter account. CCP is asshole, you know, and it's like, you know, okay, that's funny, whatever, but that's the culture. That's them saying they were waving American flags. You want to talk about a failure of Trump? It's like, do some shit to acknowledge that they are in Hong Kong waving American flags and saying the CCP is cracked. I mean, they were cracked down on, right? Mm-hmm. Hardcore. America didn't do anything. We had our most anti-China president that we've had probably ever. And even that didn't do it. But that's the power of the American culture. And that's what Yao Park talked about in that interview with Jordan Peterson, where she's like, I thought this was a place where freedom was. You know, there's an idea, there's a notion behind what America is supposed to stand for people who are, you know, so far removed from it. And it's like, whenever that's gone, it's gone. I mean, I've got a friend who lives in Australia and she's talked about this, where she's like, you don't get it. You don't get it. There are people who love liberty living where I live. And when she says that, she's meaning Australia. And she's like, we're going, don't do what's going on here. You're the only thing we have to look at. And that's what Yao Park talked about. And she's like, what if America falls, there's nothing left. She's like, there's nowhere else for us to go to. That's it. And so, yeah, it's like these ideas, like you said, about exporting culture, if we're not exporting these notions of freedom, of liberty, of I will not do what you tell me to do just because you say so. Like, you have to make a case. If America falls, then those ideas, you know, are going to be gone too, because then we're the only ones exporting that, is my point, based on what you said. Like, the only people exporting this idea of true freedom and liberty is us, and that's it. And I don't know how much longer we'll hold out as that exporter.
Yeah, absolutely, 100%.
To speak on a positive note, by the way, before we get to this next part.
Right. I swear the sunshine and rainbows is coming somewhere, I swear.
We're so happy. It's so good.
Might be in the next episode. So to continue from the book, there's this one, I mean, like, he's done so many times highlighting these terms and how they're abused. In 1944, last I checked, that's 2021. That's at least 10 years later. So and it's amazing. It calls us out. So I'll just quote directly from your quote. The conflict between formal justice and formal equality before the law on one hand, and the attempts to realize various ideals of substantive justice and equality, on the other hand, also accounts for widespread confusion about the concept of privilege and its consequent abuse. Privilege. That's the word he's highlighting there. I don't know if any of you guys have heard of that term recently or how it's used.
Unfamiliar.
But his argument here is back in 1944 it was being abused. And again, I think his head would spin if you understood how we use it today. So to continue the quote, to mention only the most important instance of this abuse, the application of the term privilege to property as such, it would indeed be a privilege if, for example, as has sometimes been the case in the past, land property was reserved to members of the nobility. So we talk about feudalism, like the only people eligible for landowners are people of nobility, the lords.
Rule of status.
Exactly. And continue the quote, and it is a privilege if, as is true in our time, the right to produce or sell particular things is reserved to particular people designated by authority, right? This arbitrary law that you can only, only this group can sell this, only this group can purchase that.
Which means if only this group can sell it, what the other groups can't do, they can't sell it.
Exactly.
Right? Exactly.
Yeah, arbitrary law. But to call private property as such, to call private property privilege, which all can acquire under the same rules, a privilege,
Quality.
Because only some succeed in acquiring it, is depriving the word privilege of its meaning. End quote. We are using privilege to define something that it doesn't mean. And there's a multitude of ways we do this. And I tried to break it down here as well as I could. So I say privilege today is used a term for a group of people who have typically more privileges than other groups of people. There are several problems with this. Number one, the term, even though referring to a group, is applied to the individual regardless of their particular circumstances. We think about white privilege. Doesn't matter what your individual circumstances is as a white person. If you're a part of this group, you're privileged no matter what. You're poor, you have no money, you're on the street, you're sick, you're homeless, you're still more privileged than, LeBron James. Right? Yep. I mean, this is how you abuse this. I know there's people like, oh, you're just using the extreme cases. Well, it's an abuse, right? It is defining a group and applying it to the individual. And that's a big thing about this planning advocacy is they don't really recognize the individual because they don't really care. Yep. They only care about the collective, because that is, in their defense, to build people in these collectives is the only way you can build social scale of values. Individuals, way too difficult. That is way too much information in the system. You must simplify it. You must be reductive, and everyone must be the same. All white people are the same. All black people are the same. Everyone is the exact same. And that is how you simplify this process to understand those scale of values. Number two, the term is.
Can I piggyback on that really fast before you go on?
Yep.
One, whenever you said the we over the I, that's one of the things that Yeoman Park mentioned about North Korea is it's not I love. There is no concept of I love a person. It's we. If it's not I like food, it's we like food. So it's all collective or individual. But the other part of that, whenever it's like what you're saying there with the individuals being relegated to the back seat. Let me find this here. About how privilege is being misapplied. It made me think of, so Oprah and Meghan Markle and, Prince Neutered or whatever his name was. I mean, like you said, they would say whenever they were asked, because this gets into scales is my point here, is it's like, well, what about someone who's really poor and has white privilege, and what would you say to them? And the answer is always, well, they might experience hardship. This is in like FAQs on websites where they address this. And it's like, well, what would you say to this person? It's like, well, despite being white privilege doesn't mean you don't experience hardship. It just means you don't experience hardship based on race. And so then the question is, if you are a non-white person who makes six figures a year and got called a racial slur one time, and you're a white person who is destitute in Appalachia or rural Missouri, and you've never been called a racial slur, who's more privileged? That's what they don't account for in that, is my point, is that they'll say, well, look, you're white privilege and you might still experience hardship, but you never experienced hardship on the basis of race. It's like, okay, but let's still take that one step further and say, how would you even quantify these things? A person being called a slur, but then they go home, they drive their, $120,000 car home. This is, of course, an exaggerated example, but drive it home to their $1.5 million home. And the white person who's never heard a racial slur in their life, but, is making less than $20,000 a year for the last 10 years, and they can never afford to buy their own home or anything like that, or they're addicted to meth or hydrocodone or something like that. Because they've never heard a racial slur, it's like they don't take the step further, because what they're saying is fair enough. It's like, okay, this person might hear a racial slur, this person might not. This person might be profiled, this person might not, right? But they don't take it, and they say that's the thing. That's it. That's all that determines privilege. It's like, okay, well, what about your overall quality of life, right? Your overall quality of life is completely ignored whenever they use those crazy intellectually bankrupt metrics. But of course they won't go that one step further. Anyway, but that Harry, because I think Oprah addressed that in the interview with Prince Soy Boy and Meghan Markle, and they're all super duper rich, but they're talking about white privilege and stuff. But,
well, this is a problem in combination with planning, but just highlighting privilege, which is a way to democratically gain power, because when you convince the oppressed classes that you are the solution, they're more likely to vote for you. But with the hierarchy of social values also comes, when you value oppression, a hierarchy of oppression. That's what we call the oppression Olympics, right? The intersectionality that this person, the transgender, biological female, black little person who's bipolar and has one leg, like that is like, make that person king because they won it. They got a gold medal in the oppression Olympics. And if we treat it that way, and we value oppression over, or perceived oppression over, actually what people can do, how we can how we can lift all ships, that is a natural conclusion, especially when you implement planning in those instances. So to continue along here. So number 2 is the term is abused when material and social conditions differ among groups in a society absent of arbitrary law. All people operate under the same laws. Okay. So you're still privileged, even though there's nothing privileging you here. Now, there's no doubt that white privilege has existed in certain snapshots, in certain contexts, right? There's no doubt that white privilege occurred when you walk into an all-white diner. Obviously, the privilege is posted right up there above the door.
Majority privilege.
Yeah.
It's majority privilege in those instances.
Yeah. But it can
you're
exist.
Talking about racist stuff, but exactly. As part of the law. Sorry. I know I'm interrupting you here. The white privilege thing that has existed, I always try to make this point. If you go through that Unpacking the Invisible backpack, I think it's Judith Butler, it's majority privilege. Now, your point about white privilege was instantiated in the law under Jim Crow and stuff.
Yep.
Like that was white privilege. I mean, that was like a skin color thing. That was very... That was arbitrary law. Majority privilege, if you're going to use the privilege term, it's arbitrary. Yeah. It's most often a majority privilege or whatever power rule class, right? The rule of class or the rule of status is more often the type of arbitrary privilege that we encounter. Sorry.
Yeah. No, you're good.
I'm done.
And actually, this kind of talks about it a little bit too. So the third one is the term is accurately used when referring to the creation and application of arbitrary law in the past, but then that is transposed into society today as if those laws still directly applied. I think of Ta-Nehisi Coates when I think of this, like, oh, this bad thing happened in 1960, therefore we're racist today. Bad thing happened in the Jim Crow South, therefore we're racist today. It's this insane application of just transposing that situation on today as if no circumstances, nothing has changed. We've not progressed at all. So there's no doubt that people today can benefit from those past privileges. There's no doubt that can happen in some way, although it's hard to say that the people of today should pay for the sins they didn't commit. I also think that's an important point. Not only is white privilege seen as, hey, maybe you should help black people because they're less privileged than you, but you should also you should become an ally, which does not mean that your sins are forgiven. That just means that you're going to be dragged along as long as they could suck the life out of you effectively. And that you must keep apologizing continuously, like what Prince Soy Boy you just talked about. I mean, that is that is how you use this perceived privilege in some of the most disgusting ways. And then number 4 is the proposal by many of those who advocate for social justice via planning to impose arbitrary law to fix past injustices, where we talked about Ibram X. Kendi before. This attempting to fix a problem using the methods that caused the problem in the first place. That's the same thing as using this institutionalized or this system or this institution that is filled with racism. If we give them more power, they somehow get rid of it, right? Saying this person that says, hey, I'm racist, but I can help you now because I've recognized my racism. I recognize my privilege. Therefore, I can use my privilege to somehow erase your absence of privilege, as if those people are like, well, there's no way to get rid of that privilege, so the only thing you can do is step aside, be an ally.
It's underpants gnomes, dude.
Yeah.
There's a step missing somewhere in there. I guess we just have to trust the process.
Yeah.
So that the whole, for the folks at home, the whole conversation about privilege is just one more thing. Like you said, it's like, when did Hayek write this? Quite a while ago, and all of these things have been accurate. So it's like, it's not just this corruption of language, but it's the trajectory that these ideas go. So if we were to wrap up this chapter and try to sum it up, but before we have to go here, like, again, this through line that Hayek has here is, here's all the things that we claim to value, right? That we claim to understand and value and advocate for as a society. And there's lots of people who think that they're advocating for good things, that this is a continuation of the ideas that they have supported, when in actuality, these are incompatible with the ideas that they claim to advocate for. So the point is, with the rule of law, this is equality under the law. There's this guy, his name was, I believe, Martin Luther King, who said that he wanted his, Junior, you named me after the dog, Dad. Who I'm so glad you get that. But anyway, who said, look, I don't want my kids to be judged by the color of their skin, only by the content of their character. And that's what equality under the law is it's like, whether in society or whether through the legal standards, more importantly, that you're judged just by the type of person you are. You're treated equally. You have equal opportunities. This might lead to disparate outcomes. Not only it will, if you give people freedom to do what they want, it will lead to disparate outcomes. But the alternative is to force equal outcomes through equity or whatever other thing, total government control. And when you do that, you don't bring people up, you bring the whole society down, is what happens there. And that's not a racial thing. That's just a people thing. You're not going to bring people up that don't want to go up, but you damn sure can force everyone down. And so as he ended chapter 5 with, he's like, look, as long as we have equal rules of law, as long as the law limits power, then you can probably avoid a lot of these conflicts that planning has with democracy. And then in this chapter, he's laying out, look, here's how they can use the rule of law to subvert democracy, to subvert the will of the people, subvert freedom, and basically vote in coercion and vote in despotism. Anyway, Kevin, is there anything else? I mean, what else? How would we summarize, and conclude this here?
Yeah. So it would have been ideal if we could have probably done chapter 5 and 6 together, just because they're so compatible with each other. But we did 2 hours on each of them, so that wouldn't have worked. But I mean, the planning in democracy explains why this planning idea does not run with democracy, and the planning and the rule of law dives deeper into that, because you cannot have democracy without the rule of law. You will go down the road to servitude when you start building these arbitrary laws that are only able to affect certain people at certain times, and also giving the power to the federal government or any centralized power to change the rules of the game while you're playing the game. We can't live in a society like that. It's not possible to live in that democracy with this kind of planning, and all planning leads to this kind of planning. So I love these last 2 chapters together, just because it really gives you that full view of understanding, because the first few built what democracy and planning is, did a little bit with economics, and these really dive into why are these not compatible with each other. So if anyone's watching this, listen to all the episodes. I think this is episode 5, but like, listen especially to the last one right before this one, because they just come together so nicely.
Yep. I don't have anything to add there. I think it's a good place to end it. If you guys are still here and you're still listening, please check out the other episodes. Please check out Kevin, all of his content, Engineering Politics. I didn't introduce you at the beginning of the episode like I should have, or myself. I mean, whatever. But if you're watching this, you probably know. So either way, but check him out, Engineering Politics on Locals and engineeringpolitics.locals.com. On Twitter, ENG_politics, ThinkSpot, Engineering Politics on YouTube, of course, all of these things. I don't think I left any out, did I, Kev? On any of those things?
I read a bit on Medium, but we'll see. We'll try to use some different sources for that. But yeah, but treating me well. Find
Cool.
Truman at returntoreason.locals.com. Big growing locals community. I know you have some conversations, so there's some big creators. So really excited to see that coming up. You're also on Twitter at My Mundane Mind. You go on YouTube to search Return to Reason, ThinkSpot search Return to Reason, Medium search Return to Reason. Did I miss anything there?
No, although I will say, whenever I was typing in Return to Reason on YouTube the other day, someone else had just created a Return to Reason YouTube account, and I was like, "You bastard!" Like, so I'm the person that looks like me in my profile picture on.
So I just listened to
YouTube.
something that said someone already had the little Dicky on monster.com. So I'm little Dicky -2. Like, what?
Oh,
yeah.
Yeah, I'm a little Dicky too. I'm Return to Reason 1. All right, yes, not 2. Yeah. That guy's 2.
Hashtag OG.
Anyway, all right. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate you. Anyway, all right. Thank you for watching. We appreciate your support, and we will catch you next time. Peace.
See ya.